Whoops. Okay. Yeah. So our topic for tonight, or for this session, is livestock. And just to give a quick rundown, a quick intro, we are basing this series of discussions on the Project Drawdown framework. It is basically a group that went and took all these different climate change solutions and did a bunch of research on them, reviewed the research, did economic analysis, crunched a lot of numbers, and sort of vetted this framework of different climate change solutions and put it into this framework. This framework is becoming really well known. It is sort of becoming the standard, I would say, for a lot of institutions, a lot of levels of different governments, universities, NGOs, and what a lot of these institutions are doing are using this framework to strategize what they can do as far as approaching solutions to climate change. So it's becoming more and more well known. And what is drawdown? Drawdown really is that point in the future when greenhouse gases in our atmosphere stop climbing, they kind of level out and they actually start to decline in a meaningful way. You will hear this term more and more. It's becoming used more now in popular literature, in articles. I've seen a lot of conferences reference, they'll theme their conference as trees for drawdown or the ocean for drawdown. So you're starting to hear this term be used much more, and that's essentially what it is, what it means. And just to give a little bit of framework, this is a great graphic that sort of shows what this framework is and what it's doing. So we basically have the atmosphere here in the middle. And then on the left side, we've got different sectors of societies and how much that sector contributes greenhouse gases into our atmosphere. And we can see the top three here, right? And these are global numbers. So electricity production is the biggest one there. Then we have food, agriculture, and land use. And that's because all of those things are kind of lumped together, right? So that gives this a big piece of the pie. And then that third highest one being industry. So these are all the sectors contributing those gases, those inputs into our atmosphere. And then on the right side, what we have are outputs. What are the things that are taking those greenhouse gases back out of the atmosphere? And so far to date, we've got basically natural systems that do this for us. We have land sinks such as forests, soils, and we have coastal and ocean sinks. So things like mangroves, eelgrass beds, kelp forests, plankton, those types of things. Then we have about 59% remaining. That means that is the percentage that kind of remains in the atmosphere. So you can see we're out of balance. A lot more input than we actually have output, and hence the situation we're in with climate change. So when we're talking about solutions, we can really look at both sides of these equations. There, on the left side, what we really need to be focusing on are reducing these numbers, right? Reducing emissions through changes, through technology, through behavioral change, or whatever it is. And then on the left side, we can really focus on protecting those systems, protecting those natural systems that are doing this critical work for us, and helping to amplify these systems, maybe through restoration or other things like that, so that we can make the numbers on the right side a little higher while we make the numbers on the left side a little lower, and we can get a better balance and we can achieve that drawdown. So we're doing this series of 5 talks, and tonight we're talking about livestock. So this would fit into that previous graphic in that food and agriculture sector, right? So we're looking at tonight through this conversation, we're looking at solutions within that sector, but we're also looking at land sinks in a sense, right? How do our livestock impact soils? How do they impact the vegetation on the landscape? Can we use livestock to help amplify land sinks? And there's a lot of information out there that says, yes, we can. So in talking about livestock, these are, the next few slides are some cool visual graphics that I threw in here. This is actually a really, really cool website. It is sort of this clearinghouse, well, not clearinghouse, but this hub of livestock data, global livestock data. And what this organization does is it collects all this data, it analyzes it, it does these different calculations, and it creates these amazing graphics. And what's really cool is once you get on here, all these graphics are interactive. So you can hover over things, you can drill down for more information, for clarification. It's a really interesting site if you want to know more about livestock in relation to climate change and greenhouse gases. So I just have a couple examples of some of these graphics up here. This one happens to show livestock per species, right? The most common species that people around the world raise for a protein source, for eggs, for meat, for milk, those types of things. And what we see here is the size of the bubble indicates the overall greenhouse gas emissions from that species. Again, these are global numbers. And then the x-axis here is really just showing pure protein, right? Tons of protein produced. The y-axis is giving us this emissions intensity number. So the intensity of the emissions put into the atmosphere in relation to the amount of protein that you're getting out of that species. So it's a really interesting visual. We can see that goats have actually a rather high emissions intensity in relation to the amount of protein they produce, right? So that's rather interesting. Cattle are clearly producing the greatest emissions globally overall, although they are very effective at producing a high amount of protein source. So it's really interesting to sort of look at this visually and see where these things fall. And if you're in the website, you can hover over these blobs and you can drill down into parts of the globe and things like that and get a lot more information. So really kind of interesting. And then this next one shows this broken down per region, right? So the same X and Y axis, right? We have protein produced at the bottom. We have emissions intensity here on the side, and then the blob represents overall emissions. And we can see where different parts of the globe fall in their protein production versus emissions. Latin America and the Caribbean are producing a lot of protein, but they're pretty high in emissions. North America and Europe are kind of interesting, right? North America is producing a lot of protein for a decent amount of emissions, while Europe is, getting close to our emissions, but produces a lot less protein. So, interesting nuance when you start to play with some of these graphics. So it's really cool to sort of get in here and play around and see what's going on with livestock in relation to greenhouse gases. And so when we're talking about livestock and greenhouse gases, we really have 3 main buckets of how greenhouse gases are produced. So the first one is kind of how are livestock produced? Are they in grazing systems? Are they in industrial systems? Are they in backyards and homesteads? The way livestock are grazed, the way they're raised, the way they're produced has a bearing on the amount of emissions that will come from these systems. What are livestock eating? That's our second bucket. Their digestive systems actually create greenhouse gases. Ours do too. You know, depending on the size of the animal, like cows, you can get a lot of emissions out of a cow. So are they eating grasses? Are they eating grains? Are they eating seaweeds? There's research in feeding cows seaweed. They produce less emissions when they eat seaweed. So their diet actually has bearing on the amount of emissions that livestock will produce. And then that third bucket is manure. The waste that livestock produce, how do we handle that waste? There are ways we can handle it that produce a lot of greenhouse gases, and there are ways that we can handle livestock waste that really minimizes the amount of greenhouse gases. So, you know, are we using manure lagoons? Are we composting livestock waste? Are we using digesters? So these are all aspects in managing livestock, raising livestock, and managing the amount of greenhouse gases that are associated with that. And then the breakout rooms that we were going to have one was manure management. So talking about that manure piece, right? If you have a lot of livestock and they're producing manure, how are you handling that? How are you coping with it? Composting, manure digesters, really making sure that we're avoiding anaerobic conditions when it comes to livestock manures. Anaerobic conditions are when you start to get a low level of oxygen or a lack of oxygen. And what happens is a lot of methane starts to be produced in conditions like that. So that was one topic. The other topic was going to be managed grazing, how we're grazing livestock, how we're treating soils and the plants on the landscape. So looking at grazing rotations, at the density of livestock on different parcels of land, the timing of when we graze our livestock. And this is actually a practice that Project Drawdown highlights. And they've done some calculations. And if managed grazing was done at scale, the potential for dealing with CO2 equivalents is 16.42 to 26.01 gigatons over the next 30 years. So that's fairly significant. And then the last one we were going to cover was Silva Pasture. So Silva Pasture is basically a way to graze livestock in sort of this synergistic three-component system. The system consists of trees, the understory forage, and then the livestock themselves. And this, again, is another practice highlighted in Project Drawdown. And according to their calculations, if done at scale, the potential for this practice would be 26.58 to 42.31 gigatons of CO2 equivalents over the next 30 years. So another significant one. So we can see that the way we manage our livestock, the way we raise our livestock can really have an effect on climate change. So that is what I've got.